The cold came down from the high ridges like something alive, something with teeth. It pressed through the timber, scraped across the granite faces of the peaks, and settled into the valley floor where the snow lay 3 feet deep and crusted hard enough to hold the weight of a man if he stepped careful. But Rowan Dunhill was not a careful man by nature. He was a deliberate one. There was a difference, and the difference had kept him alive through 4 years of war and 5 more years of silence in the mountains of Montana Territory. He rode the tree line that morning the way he always did, following the boundary he had marked with axe cuts into the bark of the tallest pines. Every Tuesday, rain or snow or wind that could peel the skin off a man's face. The routine was the point. Routine kept a man from thinking, and thinking was the enemy. Thinking brought the dreams back. Not just the night ones, the ones that woke him gasping on his bedroll with sweat freezing on his neck, but the daytime ones too. The ones that crept in when the world got too quiet, and suddenly the smell of pine sap became the smell of gunpowder, and the crack of a branch under snow became the crack of a Springfield rifle, and the white of the snow became the white of a dead man's face staring up from a ditch outside Shiloh. Rowan was 33 years old. He had been a soldier from the age of 20 to 24, a drifter from 24 to 28, and a mountain man from 28 until now. The first identity had nearly killed him. The second had hollowed him out. The third had given him something close to peace. Though peace was a word he used carefully, the way a man with a broken leg uses the word walking. He could do it. It just never felt right. His horse, a dun gelding named Rake, for the way he dragged his back hooves through loose ground, stopped mid-stride and lifted his head. Nostrils flared, ears forward. Rowan's hand went to the colt on his hip before his conscious mind caught up with the instinct. His eyes swept the tree line in the pattern, drilled into him by 4 years of scouting. Left flank first, then right, then the middle distance, then the horizon. No movement, no color that did not belong, no smoke. But Rake did not spook at nothing. The horse had survived a grisly encounter 2 winters back by standing perfectly still while the bear walked past close enough to touch, and Rowan trusted the animal's judgment more than most men's words. He followed the horse's gaze downhill toward a break in the timber, where a massive pine had fallen across a granite shelf, its root ball torn from the earth and frozen upright like a dark hand reaching from the ground. And there at the base of the fallen trunk, half buried in the drift that had accumulated against the windward side, was a shape that did not belong to the mountain. Rowan dismounted. He pulled the Winchester from the saddle scabbard and held it low, one hand on the lever, and approached on foot. His boots broke through the crust with each step sinking to mid-calf, and he moved slow, scanning the trees for ambush. The raids last fall had been real enough. Settlers and miners and men with more guns than sense had been pushing into territory that was not settled by any law Rowan recognized, and trouble followed them like crows following a plow. 20 feet from the shape, he stopped. It was a person, lying on their side legs, drawn up, arms folded against the chest. A woman, young from what he could see. She wore a dress that had once been fine dark blue fabric with small lace details at the collar and cuffs, the kind of dress that a woman wore to church in a city or to step off a stagecoach in a town she had never seen before. The dress was torn badly. One sleeve ripped open from shoulder to elbow. The fabric along her ribs and hips split wide, showing skin that was not the pink of cold, but the purple-black of bruising. Her hair, honey blonde and wavy, spread across the snow in frozen strands like cracks in glass. Her lips were the color of a winter sky just before dark, blue going to gray. Rowan knelt beside her and set the Winchester down within reach. He pulled off his right glove and pressed 2 fingers against her throat just below the jaw. He held them there for 5 seconds. Nothing. He adjusted, pressing slightly harder, and waited. 10 seconds. There. Faint as a whisper through a closed door, but there. A pulse. Slow and thin and stubborn. He looked at her face. Young, maybe just past 20. Fine-boned with high cheekbones and a small straight nose. Even unconscious, even half frozen. There was something in the set of her jaw that spoke of will. This was not a face that surrendered easily. Whatever had brought her here, whatever had torn her dress and left those bruises on her ribs, she had not gone quietly. His eyes found the mark on her left shoulder, where the dress fabric had torn away completely. A burn, circular, precise, about the size of a man's thumbnail. The edges were red and slightly raised, the center scarred and pale. Not an accident, not a brand from a ranch iron which would have been larger and rougher. This was deliberate, careful. Someone had pressed something small and hot, a lit cigar or a heated coin against her skin, and held it there long enough to scar. Rowan had seen marks like that in the war. Not on soldiers, on prisoners. On people who had been held and hurt slowly, methodically by men who enjoyed the holding and the hurting. His stomach clenched. He looked at her again with different eyes. The torn dress was not from the cold or the forest. It had been torn by hands. The bruises were not from a fall. They were from fists, and the burn was not from an accident. It was a signature. Someone had marked her the way a rancher marks a steer, and the thought of it made something hot and dark rise in Rowan's chest, something he had spent 5 years trying to bury in the silence of the mountains. He stood and looked around. No tracks in the snow except a faint drag mark almost completely filled by the fresh powder that had fallen overnight. She had crawled here or been dragged hours ago. Whoever had done this was gone. The question was whether they might come back. The other question, the harder one, stood in front of him like a wall. Take her in or ride on. Taking her in meant breaking every rule he had built his life around since coming to Montana. No strangers, no complications, no connections beyond his two brothers, who understood the rules because they had watched him write them in silence, in solitude over 5 hard years. Taking her in meant explaining to Beckett who would see danger, explaining to Nolan who would see a patient. It meant risking whatever had done this to her, following her trail to his door. Riding on meant she would die. Not maybe, not probably. Certainly. In this cold, in this condition, she had hours at best. And Rowan Dunhill, who had spent 5 years convincing himself that he had left the man he used to be on a battlefield in Tennessee, discovered in that moment that the man he used to be was not as dead as he had hoped. His father's voice came to him clear as if the old man were standing beside him in the snow. A memory from boyhood, from the farm in Pennsylvania, from a lifetime before the war turned everything to ash. You can be a lot of things in this life, son, but don't you ever be the man who walks past someone down and doesn't stop. Rowan bent down and slid his arms under her. She weighed almost nothing, which was wrong. Even a small woman should have weighed more than this. He could feel her bones through the torn dress, the sharp edges of ribs and hip and shoulder blade. She had not eaten properly in days, maybe longer. He lifted her against his chest and carried her to Rake, who stood patient and still watching with the calm disinterest of a horse that had seen its rider do strange things before and expected nothing less. Getting her onto the saddle took effort. Rowan climbed up first, then pulled her up in front of him, settling her sideways across the saddle with her head against his shoulder and her legs across the horse's neck. He wrapped his heavy coat around her, tucking the edges under her body, and pulled her close. She stirred once. Her eyelids fluttered, and for a fraction of a second he saw her eyes. Green, bright emerald green, vivid even through the haze of unconsciousness. Her lips moved, shaping a sound he could not hear. A name maybe, or a prayer. Then she went limp again, and her head fell against his chest with a weight that felt like trust, though he knew it was only gravity. The ride back took 2 hours. 2 hours of holding her steady against the rhythm of the horse, his arms locked around her, his fingers numb from the cold he had given away with his coat. Every few minutes he leaned down and put his ear near her mouth, listening for breath. Each time the faint warmth against his skin confirmed she was still alive, and each time the relief hit him harder than it should have. He did not know this woman. He did not know her name or her story, or what she had done, or what had been done to her. But the weight of her against his chest, the fragile persistence of her breathing, the way her fingers had curled unconsciously around the collar of his shirt, these things had already changed something in him, and he knew it, and the knowing made him afraid in a way that bullets never had. He thought about the last time he had held someone dying. A boy named William Pratt, 19 years old, from a farm outside Harrisburg, shot through the stomach at Chickamauga. Rowan had held him for 40 minutes while the boy cried for his mother and bled out in the mud. He had held him until the crying stopped and the body went still, and the weight changed the way weight changes when the person inside it leaves. He had carried that weight for 9 years. He was not sure he could carry another. But he kept riding, and she kept breathing. And the cabin came into view just as the afternoon light began to fill smoke from the morning fire still curling thin and pale from the chimney. He kicked the door open with his boot. The cabin was warm. The stove in the center of the main room glowed orange through its iron grate, and the air smelled of pine smoke and venison stew that had been simmering since morning. It was a solid cabin, bigger than most homesteads this far up the mountain, built by three men who knew how to work timber. Three beds along the far wall, a long table near the stove shelves lined with supplies, a window on each side shuttered against the cold. It was spare and clean and functional, built for survival, not comfort, and it had been home to the three Dunhill brothers for 5 years without a single visitor crossing its threshold. Until now. Beckett was on his feet before the door finished swinging. He had been sitting at the table cleaning a skinning knife, and he rose with the coiled speed of a man whose body was always ready for trouble. His right hand went to the hunting knife on his belt fingers, wrapping around the handle with the ease of long practice. His amber eyes identical to Rowan's, but sharper, more volatile, locked onto the woman in his brother's arms. "What the hell is this, Rowan?" His voice was low. Not loud, never loud when it mattered, but edged like the blade he carried. Beckett Dunhill was 31 years old, 2 years younger than Rowan, and built along the same massive lines, tall and broad-shouldered and thick, with the kind of muscle that came from years of splitting wood and hauling game down mountain trails. But where Rowan was stone, Beckett was flint. Where Rowan went quiet under pressure, Beckett caught fire. He was the fastest of the three brothers, with a rifle the most dangerous in a fight, and the least patient with anything he could not control. A strange woman in their cabin was exactly the kind of thing he could not control. Nolan was different. The youngest Dunhill brother, 28, stood up from the chair by the window where he had been reading a battered medical text he had found in an abandoned supply wagon 3 years ago. He set the book down carefully the way he did everything and crossed the room in 3 quick strides. He looked at the woman in Rowan's arms, and Rowan watched his brother's face change. Not shock, not anger, assessment. Nolan's eyes moved over her the way they moved over a wounded animal, cataloging damage, calculating what could be fixed. "Put her on your bed," Nolan said. His voice was calm in a way that had nothing to do with indifference and everything to do with focus. "I need hot water, clean cloth, and the bear grease jar from the top shelf." Rowan carried her to his bed, the one nearest the stove, and laid her down on the wool blankets. In the lamplight, the damage was worse than it had looked in the snow. The bruises on her ribs were deep layered, some fresh and dark, others older and yellowing at the edges. Her shoulder bore the round burn mark he had already seen, but there were others he had missed in the dim light outside. A thin scar across her forearm, healed but relatively recent. Rope marks on her wrists faded to pink. This woman had been held and hurt for longer than a single night. Nolan knelt beside the bed and went to work with steady hands. He cleaned the burn with warm water, examined the bruises with gentle pressure, checked her breathing and her pulse. Rowan stood back and watched his youngest brother transform into the thing he was best at being, the healer. The fixer, the one who put broken things back together while Rowan and Beckett broke them. Beckett did not watch. Beckett grabbed Rowan by the arm and pulled him outside onto the porch into the cold. "Talk," Beckett said. His breath came in sharp white bursts. "Who is she? Where did you find her? And why is she in our house?" Rowan told him. The tree line, the fallen pine, the torn dress, the bruises, the burn. Beckett listened with his arms crossed and his jaw working the way it always did when he was keeping words behind his teeth. When Rowan finished, Beckett spoke. "You don't know who she is. Could be a thief. Could be running from the law. Could be somebody's wife who got mouthy and got hit and ran off into the snow to make a point. Could be anything, Rowan. And you brought her here, to our home. The one place we don't let the world touch." Rowan heard everything his brother said and understood all of it. Beckett was not cruel. Beckett was practical in the way that men who have lost too much become practical. He did not want to care about anyone outside the three of them, because caring meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant loss, and Beckett Dunhill had decided somewhere in the years after their parents died that he would never lose anything again if he could help it. "Did you see the burn on her shoulder?" Rowan asked. His voice was flat, the same tone he used when he was done discussing. Beckett's jaw tightened. "Someone pressed a lit cigar into her skin," Rowan continued. "Held it there. On purpose. Precise. Like marking livestock." He let the words settle. "You want me to ride back out there and dump her in the snow, you carry the reins yourself." Beckett stared at him. The flint in his eyes sparked, but did not catch. He turned without a word and went back inside. He did not go to the bed where Nolan was working. He went to the chair nearest the door, sat down, pulled the hunting knife from his belt and laid it across his thigh, his eyes fixed on the door. He was guarding it. Beckett Dunhill did not agree with what his brother had done. But Beckett Dunhill would die before he let anything come through that door uninvited, while a defenseless woman lay in the bed behind him. That was the contradiction at the heart of him, the anger and the honor twisted together so tight that even he could not tell where one ended and the other began. Nolan worked through the night. He changed the wet compress on her forehead every hour. He spooned warm bone broth between her cracked lips, drop by drop, patient as rainfall. He cleaned and dressed the burn on her shoulder with bare grease and a strip of clean cloth. He checked her pulse, her breathing, the color of her skin, the temperature of her hands and feet. As he worked, he noticed things. Her hands were calloused at the fingertips in a pattern he recognized from watching Rowan mend leather. But these were not leather workers' calluses. They were finer, more precise. Seamstress hands. The hands of a woman who had spent years pushing a needle through fabric for hours at a time. These were working hands, not beggar's hands, not thief's hands. He also noticed that her injuries told a story with a timeline. The rope marks on her wrists were oldest, faded to thin pink lines. The scar on her forearm was newer, maybe a month old. The bruises were layered, some a week old some days. And the burn was the freshest wound of all, still angry at the edges. Whatever had happened to this woman, it had happened over a period of weeks, and it had gotten worse as it went on. Nolan did not share these observations with his brothers that night. He filed them away the way he filed away everything he learned from his medical books, carefully, precisely waiting for the moment when the knowledge would be needed. Instead, he focused on keeping her alive, which was a simpler problem and one he could solve with hot water and patience, and the stubborn refusal to let death take something from him when he had the tools to fight it. Rowan did not sleep. He sat on the floor near the stove, his back against the wall, his Colt on the planks beside him. Every sound, the pop of resin in the firewood, the whistle of wind through the shutter gaps, the small unconscious sound she made beneath the blankets has brought his head up fast, the old soldier in him refusing rest. By dawn, his eyes burned from the long watch, and his body ached from the cold floor, and something in his chest felt different than it had the morning before. Heavier, more complicated, like carrying a load he had not agreed to carry but could not put down. When the first gray light pushed through the cracks in the shutters, he checked her breathing one more time. Stronger. Her lips had lost some of the blue. Her chest rose more evenly under the blankets. She was going to live. He was not sure why that knowledge hit him as hard as it did. She woke in the late morning, and the first thing she did was try to kill Nolan. Not deliberately, not with planning. She woke the way a trapped animal wakes, all instinct and no thought, her body reacting to the presence of danger before her mind had time to assess whether danger was actually present. Her eyes flew open wide and wild, the emerald green of them almost shocking in the dim cabin light. She saw three men, large men surrounding her in a room she did not recognize. She was in a bed that was not hers, wearing a shirt that was not hers, a flannel shirt 3 times her size that smelled of wood smoke and honest sweat. Every memory of the last 2 weeks crashed over her at once. The hands, the laughter, the dark room, the pain, the burn. She bolted upright, slamming her back against the wall behind the bed, and her right hand scrabbled across the small table beside the pillow until her fingers closed around something hard and cold. Nolan's pocket knife. She held it in front of her, the blade barely 3 inches long. Her hand shaking so badly the steel caught the lamplight and threw it across the walls in stuttering flashes. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps. Her eyes, those remarkable green eyes, darted from face to face, measuring distance, calculating escape. The three brothers froze. In that moment, each of them became exactly who they were. Rowan extended his right hand, palm up, fingers open, the way he had once calmed a spooked horse on a battlefield with shells falling 50 yards away. His voice came out low and steady, almost hypnotic in its evenness. "Nobody here is going to touch you unless you say so. My name is Rowan Dunhill. I found you in the snow yesterday. These two are my brothers." Beckett said nothing. He simply took one step backward. It was a small movement, barely noticeable. But to a woman who had spent 2 weeks surrounded by men who only stepped closer, never back, it meant everything. Nolan lowered himself slowly to one knee, bringing his eyes level with hers. His voice was quiet, unhurried. the voice of a man who understood that gentleness was not weakness but a choice, and that sometimes it was the hardest choice of all. "You're hurt pretty bad. I've been patching you up since last night. That knife isn't very sharp, but if holding it makes you feel safer, you keep it." Something shifted in her face. Not trust. Trust was miles away. But the raw animal panic eased 1 degree. Her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. Her grip on the knife loosened without releasing. She looked from Rowan to Beckett to Nolan, and Rowan could see her mind working behind those green eyes, weighing, sorting, trying to fit these three men into the categories she had learned in the last terrible weeks. Threat or safety, predator or something else. The silence stretched. The fire crackled. Wind pressed against the shutters. Then she spoke. One word. Her voice was a ruin, cracked and rough, scraped raw by cold and thirst and screaming that no one had heard. "Elowen." Rowan nodded. "Elowen, Joan," he repeated. The name was unfamiliar on his tongue, but he said it with the same deliberate weight he gave to everything that mattered. It was not just a name. It was a declaration. She was not a body he had carried from the snow. She was a person. She had a name. The days that followed moved with the slow weight of deep winter. Outside, the world was white and silent and brutal. Inside the cabin, a new kind of weather was forming. Elowen healed faster than any of them expected. By the second day, she was sitting upright in bed, eating broth without help. By the third, she was standing, though she swayed and had to catch herself on the bedpost. By the fourth, she was moving around the cabin, and it became clear almost immediately that Elowen Ashby was not a woman who knew how to sit still. Her hands reached for work the way a drowning person reaches for air. She folded blankets, swept the floor, organized the supply shelves that three men had left in comfortable chaos for 5 years. She did not do it to repay a debt. She did it because stillness frightened her more than anything in the mountains. And in her movement through the small space of the cabin, she began to build a separate relationship with each brother, three threads of connection as different as the men themselves. With Rowan, it was silence. He gave her space the way he gave himself space, instinctively, almost compulsively. He slept in the woodworking shed behind the cabin, surrendering his bed to her without discussion. And he came inside only to eat and to check on her from across the room with glances he thought she did not notice. But she noticed everything. She noticed the coffee he left on the bedside table each morning before she woke, hot and strong and waiting like a small daily proof that someone in the world was thinking of her. She noticed the water bucket that emptied when she tried to lift it and reappeared full beside the door without a word spoken. She noticed the extra firewood stacked near the stove each evening, more than was needed, as if he were trying to build a wall between her and the cold with split pine. And she noticed his nightmares. On the fourth night, she woke to a sound. She recognized a low grinding moan that came from deep in the chest, the sound of a man fighting something in his sleep that he could not fight awake. She looked out from the bed and saw Rowan on the floor near the stove, his body rigid, his fists clenched, sweat shining on his forehead in the dying firelight. She rose carefully, took the blanket from her own bed, and crossed the room. She did not touch him. She knew better. A person who lives inside their own fear should never be startled awake. She simply laid the blanket over him and sat down nearby, close enough for her presence to register in whatever dark place his mind had taken him, and she waited. Waited until his breathing slowed. Waited until his fists unclenched. Waited until the moan faded and his body went still in the weight of real sleep, not tortured sleep. In the morning, Rowan woke with a blanket on him that he had not put there, and a cup of coffee on the floor beside him that he had not made. He looked at the blanket. He looked at the coffee. He looked across the room to where Elowen sat by the stove mending a tear in one of Beckett's shirts with small, precise stitches. Neither of them said a word. But that night, Rowan did not go back to the shed. He slept on the cabin floor near the stove. Closer. With Beckett, the connection came through collision. Beckett remained wary, not hostile, but watchful, the way a guard dog watches a stranger who has been allowed inside the fence but has not yet been approved. He spoke to her in short sentences and kept his distance. Until the morning, she went outside and tried to split firewood. She had found the heavy axe leaning against the chopping block and picked it up with both hands. She understood the principle. She had watched Beckett do it from the window. But the axe was too heavy for her arms, and on the third swing, the blade glanced off the log and arced toward her foot. She yanked her leg back just in time, the steel biting into the frozen ground inches from her toes. Beckett was beside her before she could draw breath. He grabbed the axe handle and ripped it from her grip, his amber eyes blazing. "You trying to lose a foot?" And something in Elowen broke open, not the frightened, cornered animal she had been when she first woke. Something older and fiercer, something that had kept her alive through 14 years of orphanage discipline and 8 years of factory labor and 2 weeks of captivity. The anger she had swallowed and swallowed and swallowed came roaring up from the place where she had buried it. "I have fed myself since I was 14 years old," she said, and her voice did not shake. "I survived 2 weeks of hell and 2 days in the snow. Do not look at me like I am something that will break." Beckett stared at her. The flint in his eyes struck against the steel in hers, and for a long moment neither gave ground. Then something happened that neither Rowan nor Nolan, watching from separate windows, had ever seen before. The corner of Beckett's mouth twitched. Not a smile. Beckett did not smile, but something close, something that acknowledged a worthy adversary. He set a smaller axe beside the chopping block. "Use this one, left hand on the top of the handle, right in the middle. Swing straight down, not across." He walked away without another word, but from that day forward he taught her. Splitting kindling, setting rabbit snares, reading animal tracks in the snow. Not because he wanted closeness, because Beckett Dunhill respected anyone who refused to stay down, and Elowen Ashby had refused with a fury that matched his own. With Nolan, the connection was warmth. He became her first real friend, though neither of them used the word. He taught her frontier cooking, the things that could be made from venison and salt and flour and whatever the forest offered. She taught him to sew properly, her needlework precise and elegant next to his clumsy stitching, and they laughed together about it in the evenings while she repaired the months of accumulated damage to the brothers' clothing. Nolan read aloud from his medical text, the old-fashioned language, turning descriptions of bone setting and wound care into unintentional comedy, and their laughter soft and genuine filled corners of the cabin that had been silent for years. It was Nolan she told first on a quiet evening when Rowan and Beckett had already fallen asleep. She told him about the orphanage in Boston, the iron beds with thin blankets, the meals that were never enough, the headmistress who disciplined with a ruler across the knuckles. She told him about the seamstress work 14 hours a day, bent over fabric in a room with 20 other women, her fingers bleeding into the cloth, her wages barely covering a room the size of a closet. She told him about the letter in the newspaper, the advertisement for a mail-order bride, a man in Montana who needed a wife, a house waiting, a life waiting. She knew it could be a trap. But in Boston, the future was a word that meant more of the same forever, and even a trap was a door, and a door was a chance. At least, she said, her voice tired and clear-eyed, in Montana, the sky is wide. On the 5th day, she told all of them. She sat by the fire wearing the flannel shirt and the wool socks that Nolan had left beside the bed for her, and she spoke in a voice that was low and level and completely detached. The way people speak when they have separated themselves from their own memories in order to survive them. "I am a mail-order bride. I answered an advertisement in a Boston newspaper. A man said he needed a wife in Montana. He sent fare for the stage. I had no family, no reason to stay." She paused, staring into the flames. "When I arrived, there was no groom. Only a man named Crosby Phelps and his men. He collects women, sells them to mining camps, to ranches, to whoever pays. 2 weeks. There were 3 other women besides me. When his men fought over the money split, I ran. 2 days in the snow." She pulled the collar of the flannel shirt aside, revealing the round burn scar on her left shoulder. "He marked me, like marking cattle." The silence in the cabin had weight. Nolan's hand stopped moving, frozen mid-stitch. Rowan did not look up from the rifle he was cleaning, but the cloth in his hand went still, and the knuckles of his fist turned white. Beckett stood up, walked out the door, and did not come back for 20 minutes. Through the cabin walls, they heard the sound of an axe hitting wood over and over, rhythmic and furious, the only language Beckett had for the thing he was feeling. When he came back in breathing hard sawdust on his forearms, he did not speak. He sat down in his chair by the door and picked up his knife. But his eyes, when they passed over Elowen, had changed. The wariness was still there, but underneath it was something new. something that looked very much like the beginning of loyalty. That night, after the lamps were dimmed and the cabin settled into the sounds of sleep, Rowan sat alone at the table. He was not cleaning his rifle. He was not doing anything. He was staring at the wall and thinking about a man named Crosby Phelps, who burned women with cigars and sold them like livestock. And he was thinking about what he would do if he ever stood in the same room as that man. The answer came to him clearly and without hesitation, and it was not the answer of a lawman or a soldier or a man who lived by rules. It was the answer of something older and simpler, and it frightened him a little because he had spent 5 years trying to be something other than what the war had made him, and in that moment he was not sure he had succeeded. Far from the cabin, far from the warmth of the stove and the sound of Elowen's breathing, the world was not done with her. In a cramped office at the back of a stagecoach station in a town called Garrow Station, 2 days' ride to the southwest, a heavy man with a red face and carefully trimmed whiskers sat behind a desk and slammed his fist down hard enough to rattle the inkwell. Crosby Phelps was not a man who lost things. He was a man who collected things, acquired things, maintained inventories and ledgers, and careful records of transactions conducted in darkness. The three women still locked in the cellar beneath the horse barn were assets. The one who had run was a liability. She knew his name. She knew his face. She knew the location of the cellar and the number of women inside it, and the names of at least two of the men who worked for him. If she lived, if she talked, if she found someone willing to listen, Crosby Phelps would hang. Not maybe, not probably, certainly. And Crosby Phelps had no intention of hanging. Harlan Oakes stood before the desk, his face bruised from the fight that had broken out among Phelps's men the night the girl escaped. He was 36, lean and hard, a former mercenary who had found that working for Phelps paid better than soldiering and required roughly the same moral flexibility. He was good at finding people, better at making sure they were not found again. "Find her," Phelps said. His voice was calm, which was worse than shouting. "Alive or dead, I don't care. But find her before she finds a badge or a judge or anyone with the authority to ask questions I can't answer." Harlan checked his revolver, slid a second knife into his boot, and walked out into the snow. Two men followed him, nameless, faceless, the kind of men who existed in the spaces between law and civilization, and did whatever they were paid to do without asking why. Three riders moved north through the timber, following a trail that was 2 weeks old and fading fast. But trails in snow country never disappear completely. The snow remembers, and men like Harlan Oakes knew how to read what the snow remembered. Back in the cabin on the mountain, Elowen sat by the stove in the late evening light, the fire crackling. Low, the wool socks pulled up to her calves. She flexed her toes inside them, feeling the warmth seep into skin that had been cold for so long she had forgotten what warm feet felt like. Her shoulders dropped, her eyes closed. For the first time since she had stepped off the stagecoach in Montana territory and realized that the life she had been promised was a lie, she felt something she was almost afraid to name. Not safety. Safety was too big a word, too final, too much like a promise that could be broken. But something smaller and more honest. A pause. A breath between one danger and the next. A moment where the world was not actively trying to destroy her. She did not know that the moment had an expiration date, miles away, moving through the timber under a moon that turned the snow to silver. Harlan Oakes rode with his collar up and his eyes down, reading the faint marks in the crust that told him a woman had crawled this way, bleeding and freezing and alone, and that someone had found her and carried her away on horseback. The tracks led north, toward the mountains, toward the high country where the Dunhill brothers lived in their cabin at the edge of the world. Elowen had just begun to feel safe, but safety, like everything else in Montana territory in the winter of 1873, was a thing that could be taken away. And the men coming to take it were already closer than anyone knew. 2 weeks passed, and the cabin on the mountain became a different place. Not in its bones, which were still rough-hewn timber and iron nails, in a stove that needed feeding every 4 hours, but in its breath. A cabin with 3 men living inside it has a certain rhythm, steady, functional, stripped to essentials. A cabin with 4 people in it, one of them, a woman who could not sit still, has another rhythm entirely, and the shift happened so gradually that none of them noticed until it was already too late to undo. Elowen healed with a stubbornness that surprised all 3 brothers. By the end of the first week, the blue had left her lips, and the trembling had left her hands, and the hollows under her cheekbones had begun slowly to fill. She ate everything Nolan put in front of her, not with greed, but with the focused determination of a woman who understood that food was fuel, and fuel was survival, and survival was the only currency she had ever been able to count on. By the second week, she was on her feet for most of the day, moving through the cabin with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime making herself useful, because usefulness was the only thing that had ever kept her from being discarded. She mended clothes, not just her own, but theirs. 5 years of bachelor living had left the brothers' wardrobes in a state of cheerful disintegration. Shirts missing buttons, trousers patched with mismatched fabrics, socks, darned so many times the original material had disappeared entirely beneath layers of crude repair. Elowen sat by the fire each evening with a needle and thread from Nolan's sewing tin and worked through the pile with the speed and precision of a woman who had spent 8 years behind a sewing machine in a Boston garment factory. Her stitches were small and even and nearly invisible, and Beckett, who would sooner have chewed his own boot than complimented a stranger, put on a shirt she had mended and stood in the doorway for a moment, running his thumb along the seam where the tear had been, his expression unreadable. She cleaned the cabin. Not aggressively, not with the energy of someone trying to earn her keep, but with the natural instinct of a person who felt safer when things were in order. The shelves got organized. The table got scrubbed. The floor, which had accumulated a winter's worth of mud and wood shavings and dried venison crumbs, got swept clean for the first time since autumn. But these were surfaces. The real changes went deeper. Rowan began staying inside longer. For 5 years, his pattern had been to wake before dawn, leave the cabin, and not return until dark, filling the hours between with physical labor that kept his mind from wandering into the places where the war still lived. Now he found reasons to linger. Checking the stove damper, sharpening a tool at the table, sitting in the chair by the window with a cup of coffee that he drank slower than any man had ever drunk coffee, his eyes drifting across the rooms where Elowen sat sewing her head, bent, her honey blonde hair falling across her face, her fingers moving with the unconscious grace of long practice. He did not know she was watching him too, but she was. She watched the way he held his coffee cup, both hands wrapped around it, as if he were holding something more precious than tin and boiled water. She watched the way he positioned himself in the room, always with his back to a wall, always with a clear line of sight to the door. She watched the way his eyes went blank, sometimes mid-sentence, mid-movement, as if he had stepped through a door in his own mind and found himself somewhere else entirely, somewhere with smoke and noise and mud and screaming. And when he came back, when his eyes focused again and his hands stopped shaking, and he looked around the cabin with the slightly dazed expression of a man who was not entirely sure which world was real, she did not look away. She held his gaze steady and calm, and in that steadiness, he found something to anchor to. One evening, while Rowan and Beckett were both out, Rowan checking the horse corral, and Beckett running a trap line, Elowen told Nolan about the orphanage in more detail than she had shared before. Not the facts this time, but the feelings. The loneliness of sleeping in a room with 30 other children and feeling more alone than if she had been the only person on earth. The shame of wearing donated clothes that never fitted, always too large or too small, always carrying the ghost of whoever had worn them first. The single act of kindness she remembered from those years, a woman named Mrs. Hargrove, who worked in the kitchen and who on cold nights would tuck an extra blanket around Elowen's shoulders and whisper, "You matter, child. Don't let anyone tell you different." She built cradles, Elowen said, her voice soft and far away, for every new baby that came to the orphanage. Built them herself from scrap wood. Said every child deserved to sleep in something made with love, even if the love came from a stranger. She did not know that Rowan had come back early, that he was standing just outside the door, that he had heard every word. His hand was on the latch, but he did not open it. He stood in the cold and listened to her voice through the timber, and something shifted in his chest like tectonic plates moving deep underground, slow and massive and irreversible. Beckett's transformation was the most reluctant and therefore the most genuine. He did not soften. Beckett Dunhill was not built for softening. But he adjusted the way a stone adjusts to water running over it, not by becoming less hard, but by allowing the current to shape him without breaking. He began leaving the best cuts of meat on her plate, and at meals the pieces with less gristle, more tenderness. He did it without announcement, without eye contact, as if it were an accident of serving, rather than a deliberate act of care. Elowen noticed but said nothing, understanding instinctively that acknowledging the gesture would embarrass him, and that Beckett embarrassed was Beckett dangerous. The wood-splitting lessons continued. She got better. Her swings grew more accurate, her stance more stable, and the pile of kindling she produced each morning grew taller. One afternoon, Beckett walked past as she brought the small axe down clean through a piece of pine, the two halves falling apart with a satisfying crack. He paused, looked at the split wood, looked at her, and said two words. "Not bad." Then he kept walking. From Beckett Dunhill, those two words carried the weight of a standing ovation. Nolan's change was the most visible because Nolan was the most visible of the brothers, the one who lived on the surface of his emotions rather than bearing them in silence or anger. He began writing, not letters, not stories, but notes, medical recipes, herbal remedies, techniques for treating wounds and setting bones, and identifying the plants that grew on the mountain, which ones healed and which ones killed. He wrote in a small leather journal with a stub of pencil, his handwriting cramped and careful. Elowen asked him why one evening, and his answer carried more weight than either of them expected. "If someday I'm not here," he said, not looking up from the page, "someone needs to know these things." The words hung in the air. Elowen heard what lived beneath them, the fear that the isolation would eventually consume his brothers, that Rowan would disappear entirely into his silence, and Beckett into his anger, and that Nolan, the bridge between them, the one who kept them human, would not be enough to hold them. She reached across the table and laid her hand on his. "Teach me," she said. "I'll remember." From that day forward, Nolan taught her the medicine he had taught himself. How to clean and close a wound, which bark to boil for fever, how to set a splint and wrap a sprain. Her seamstress hands, trained by years of precise work, took to suturing with a skill that surpassed his own. And for the first time in 5 years on the mountain, Nolan had someone who cared about the things he cared about, someone who listened not out of obligation, but out of genuine interest. The loneliness he had carried, the loneliness of being the warm one in a family of cold men, the one who felt too much in a house that felt too little eased by 1 degree. And 1 degree in the dead of a Montana winter was the difference between freezing and surviving. The supplies ran out on a Tuesday. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the slow, grinding way that supplies always run out when winter lasts longer than planning. The flour bin scraped bottom. The salt bag deflated to a thin white shadow of itself. The coffee, which was not a necessity, but which had become in the weeks since Elowen's arrival, something close to sacred, a morning ritual that connected four people across the distance of their separate hours run, was down to a handful of grounds that would make one more pot if they were lucky. Rowan made the decision on Wednesday morning. They would ride into Bitterroot Crossing, all four of them. Beckett objected. "Leave her here. She's safe behind walls." Rowan shook his head. "Safe behind walls means alone behind walls. And somewhere between here and the South Ridge, there are men looking for her. I'm not leaving her alone." The argument was short because Rowan did not argue. He stated facts and let them stand, and Beckett, who understood facts even when he hated them, fell silent. They rode into Bitterroot Crossing at midday when the street was full. Three massive men on mountain horses riding in formation without discussion. Rowan in front with Elowen behind him, her arms light around his waist. Beckett on the left flank, Nolan on the right. The town was small, 200 souls clustered around a main street that held a general store, a saloon, a livery stable, a boarding house, a church, and the shared conviction that everybody's business was everybody else's business. Heads turned before they reached the first building. A rancher stopped mid-stride outside the livery and stared. Two women carrying market baskets paused on the boardwalk and leaned toward each other, whispering behind raised hands. At the saloon, a pair of miners leaned out over the swinging doors with expressions that mixed curiosity and something uglier. The Dunhill brothers were already a subject of speculation in Bitterroot Crossing, three large men living alone on the mountain, coming to town only for supplies, speaking to no one beyond what transaction required. They were tolerated because they caused no trouble and paid in cash, but they were not understood, and in a small town, what is not understood is feared, and what is feared is eventually hated. Now they had a woman with them, a young, beautiful woman with honey blonde hair and green eyes, wearing a man's flannel shirt under a coat too big for her, sitting behind the eldest brother with her arms around his waist. The whispers multiplied like sparks in dry grass. All Carvey's general store smelled of lamp oil and dried beans, and the particular mustiness of a building that had not been properly aired since October. Olin himself stood behind the counter, a thick man of 56 with a gray beard and small, shrewd eyes that had been calculating profit and loss since before the war. He watched the Dunhill brothers enter with the woman, and his expression shifted from commercial welcome to guarded suspicion with the speed of a man who had been running a ledger on the town's moral inventory for 3 decades. "Who's this Dunhill?" he asked, directing the question at Rowan, while his eyes stayed on Elowin. Rowan stacked flour and coffee and salt on the counter, his movements deliberate, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded a platoon. "She's with us. That's all you need to know." Olin's lips pressed thin. He glanced at the other customers, a farmer's wife examining fabric bolts, 2 miners comparing the prices of tobacco tins, and pitched his voice just loud enough for all of them to hear. "One girl living with 3 unmarried men. What kind of arrangement is that?" Beckett stepped forward. At his full height, he towered over Olin by nearly a foot, and the width of his shoulders blocked the light from the window behind him, throwing the shopkeeper into shadow. His amber eyes burned with the particular intensity that preceded either violence or a very short, very final conversation. "What did you say?" Olin retreated half a step, his back pressing against the shelves behind the counter. The tobacco tins rattled. He did not repeat himself. Elowen stood beside Nolan near the door. Her chin raised, her back straight, her hands clasped in front of her, with a stillness that cost her more than anyone in the room could know. She did not cower. She did not look away. The girl who had crawled through snow to dine had decided somewhere in the 2 weeks since waking in a stranger's bed with a stolen knife in her hand that she was done being the person things happened to. She was not yet sure who she was becoming instead, but she knew who she was not. She was not someone who would lower her eyes in a general store because a shopkeeper disapproved of her. Outside on the boardwalk in front of the boarding house, a woman watched them through the window. Dorinda Stratton, known to the town as Dory, was 41 years old, a widow of 4 years, and the owner of the only boarding house in Bitterroot Crossing. She had iron gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, work-roughened hands and eyes that had seen enough of the world's cruelty to recognize it on sight in a bruise and a flinch, in the particular way a woman holds herself when she is accustomed to being struck. Dory crossed the street with a folded dress over her arm, a simple cotton print in faded blue worn, but clean and mended with care. She stepped into the general store. It ignored Olin's disapproving stare and walked directly to Elowin. "You can't wear men's shirts forever," Dory said. No preamble, no introduction. The dress was held out like an offering and a declaration simultaneously. Elowin looked at the dress, then at the woman holding it, and for the first time since leaving Boston, she said 2 words that she meant with her entire body. "Thank you." Dory squeezed her hand, brief and firm. Then she leaned close and whispered, "I know what it's like when men treat you like property. You're not alone in that." As they left the store, Dory caught Rowan's arm and pulled him aside. Her voice dropped low. "3 men been asking around the valley, looking for a young woman, blonde hair, maybe hurt, maybe taken in by somebody. One of them has a long scar down his face. They were in Ridgewater 2 days ago." She held his eyes. "Whatever trouble that girl is carrying, it's coming this way." Rowan's face did not change. His hand gripping the horse's reins whitened at the knuckles. 4 days later, the trouble took a different shape than any of them expected. Not guns, not riders, something quieter and in many ways more dangerous. Reverend Aldrich Pugh rode up to the Dunhill cabin on a gray mare with a Bible tucked under his arm, and the self-assured expression of a man who had mistaken his own opinions for the voice of God. He was 51, thin as a fence rail, with deep-set eyes and a long jaw that seemed purpose-built for pronouncing judgment. He had been the spiritual authority in Bitterroot Crossing for 12 years, and he wielded that authority the way some men wielded a whip, precisely publicly, and with absolute certainty that the pain he inflicted was deserved. Rowan met him at the door and did not invite him inside. "Sheriff Dunhill," Pugh began, and Rowan did not correct the title because he had never been sheriff and Pugh knew it, which meant the formality was a weapon, a way of implying that Rowan held a responsibility to the community that he was now violating. "I come with concern. The situation here, a young unmarried woman residing with 3 unmarried men, has caused significant unease in town. It is, to speak plainly, an affront to the moral standards of our community." Rowan listened. His face was granite. His arms were folded across his chest. Behind him, through the half-open door, Elowen sat by the stove, listening, her hands frozen mid-stitch on the shirt she was mending. "I would advise," Pugh continued, his voice rich with the practiced compassion of a man who felt none, "that the young woman be relocated to Mrs. Stratton's boarding house, where her reputation and the reputation of this community can be preserved. Or better still, that she be placed on the next eastbound stage and returned to wherever she came from." Rowan let the Reverend finish. He gave the words the silence they deserved, and then he spoke in a voice that was not raised, not heated, not anything other than absolutely flat. "Reverend, this woman was kidnapped. She was beaten. She was burned with a cigar deliberately on her bare skin. She was left in the snow to die. If your morality requires me to throw her out to save the town's reputation, then I have no use for your morality." Pugh's face flushed from the collar up a dark tide of red that reached his hairline. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, and then turned his horse and rode back toward town without another word. But his back was rigid with fury, and Rowan knew with the certainty of a man who had survived 4 years of war, by reading the intentions of men who wanted him dead, that this was not over. It was not. Pugh began his campaign the following Sunday. Not by name, never by name, which would have been too direct and too easily challenged. Instead, he spoke from his pulpit about moral decay in isolated places, and the corruption that festers when Christian standards are abandoned, and the duty of righteous men to stand against those who would bring shame upon this valley. His congregation, which consisted of roughly half the town's population, listened with the attentive discomfort of people who knew exactly who he was talking about and were not sure whether to feel righteous or ashamed of their own curiosity. A group began to form, not organized, not armed, not yet, but a cluster of men who gathered outside the saloon in the evenings and talked about the Dunhill brothers and the woman and what ought to be done about it. Some of them were genuinely offended by the arrangement. Others were simply bored. A few, the dangerous ones, were men who had always resented the Dunhill brothers for their independence, their land, their refusal to participate in the social machinery of the town, and who saw this moment as an opportunity to settle scores that had nothing to do with morality and everything to do with envy. Inside the cabin, the four of them continued their slow negotiation with trust. The storm came on a Thursday night, the biggest of the winter, and it hit the mountain like a fist. Wind screamed through the gaps in the shutters. Snow drove horizontal against the cabin walls. The stove roared, but the cold pushed through anyway, the kind of cold that found every crack, every seam, every place where the timber had shrunk away from the nails and poured through like water. Nolan and Beckett lay in their beds, buried under every blanket they owned. Elowen lay in Rowan's bed, two quilts piled on top of her, and shivered so hard the bed frame rattled against the wall. Rowan watched from his place on the floor, saw her shoulders shaking beneath the covers, saw her breath coming in short white bursts in the lamplight, and made a decision that weighed more than any he had made since carrying her out of the snow. He sat down on the edge of the bed. She opened her eyes wide and alert, the green of them catching the firelight. He kept his voice low enough that only she could hear. "This kind of cold kills. The fire's not enough. Body heat is the only thing that works." She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, the weighing of risk against need of memory, against present reality of the men who had taken from her, against the man who had given. Then she nodded. Once. Small. He lay down beside her, careful to keep space between them, his hands at his sides. She lay rigid, her back half-turned, her body locked in the defensive tension of someone who had learned that closeness meant danger. Then the cold pushed harder, relentless and patient, and she pressed closer, her forehead brushing his shoulder, her hands settling uncertainly against his chest. He felt her pulse through her fingertips, fast and unsteady, the heartbeat of a small hunted thing that has found shelter but cannot quite believe the shelter is real. He did not hold her. He did not let his hands move. He lay still and gave his warmth without asking for anything in return, and slowly, degree by degree, her shivering eased. "I thought I would die out there," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "I closed my eyes and waited, but I woke up here." Rowan turned his head, meeting her gaze in the dying firelight. "Not on my watch," he said. His voice was rough with something he could not name, something that had been building in him since the moment he had knelt beside her in the snow and found a pulse where he expected silence. She searched his face for a long time. Then she let her forehead rest fully against his chest, and sleep took her, her hand still lying over his heart. Rowan lay awake listening to her breathing steady into the deep rhythm of real rest, and he thought about his mother. He had not thought about his mother in years, but the weight of Elowen's head against his chest brought back the memory of his mother's hand on his hair when he was small. The feeling of absolute safety that he had believed for most of his adult life was gone forever. Elowen had given it back to him, not with romance, not with words, with presence. The simple, devastating fact of another person choosing to be close to him. For the first time in 9 years, the nightmares did not come. Beckett woke in the deep hours and saw them. Two shapes in one bed, motionless except for the rise and fall of breathing. He said nothing. He turned his face to the wall and closed his eyes. But in the morning when Rowan came outside to split wood, Beckett looked at him with an expression that needed no translation. "Be careful, brother." Rowan nodded. He did not need to explain. 3 days later, Nolan rode into Bitterroot Crossing alone for medicine and mail. He tied his horse outside Olin Carvey's store, stepped inside, and stopped in front of the notice board near the entrance where townspeople pinned advertisements for livestock, land, and labor. A new notice had been tacked up since his last visit, a handwritten sheet on cheap paper, the ink slightly smeared from the cold. It described a young woman, blonde hair, approximately 20 years of age, missing from a stagecoach party traveling through western Montana. It described her as possibly delusional and dangerous. It offered $50 for information leading to her recovery. It bore no official seal, no lawman's signature, no territorial stamp. It was signed by a name Nolan had heard once before, spoken by Elowen, in a voice stripped of everything but fact. Crosby Phelps, Guardian and Concerned Party. Nolan stared at the notice for 10 seconds. Then he pulled it off the board, folded it, put it in his coat pocket, and paid for his supplies without speaking a word to Olin Carvey, who watched him go with the calculating eyes of a man who had already read the notice and drawn his own conclusions. Nolan rode back to the cabin at a speed that left his horse blowing foam by the time they reached the tree line. He threw the door open and laid the notice on the table without speaking. The three of them gathered around it. Elowen read it from across the room, her hands frozen on the shirt she was mending, and then she set the shirt down and walked to the table and read it again, close enough to touch. Rowan was silent, his eyes narrowed, his jaw locked, and Nolan recognized the expression. It was the face his brother wore when he was not angry, but calculating, running scenarios in his head, the way he had once run battle plans, assessing threats and distances and probabilities, with the cold precision of a man who had learned that emotion in a crisis got people killed. Beckett hit the table with his fist. The tin cups jumped. The notice fluttered. $50, he said, his voice tight with a rage that was looking for a target. That's enough to make every drifter and drunk in the territory sell their own mother. Every man in every saloon between here and Helena is going to hear about this. Then he looked at Elowen, and for the first time since Rowan had carried her through the door, Beckett's anger was not about territory or inconvenience, or the disruption of the careful isolation he had built around his family. It was about her. The anger on his face was the anger of a man defending something he had not realized he was willing to defend. Nolan looked at Elowen. His face was pale. "They're looking for you." Elowen looked at the notice, then at each of the three brothers in turn. Her hands trembled, but her voice was forged iron. "Crosby Phelps, he won't stop. I know his face, his name, and where he keeps the women. If I live, he hangs." She paused, and in the pause, the truth of the situation crystallized in the room like frost forming on glass. "I'm not just a woman he lost. I'm a witness, and witnesses are the only thing men like him are afraid of." The notice changed everything. Elowen was no longer just a woman in need of protection. She was a target with a price on her head, and every man who passed through a saloon or a trading post between Bitterroot Crossing and the territorial capital might be the one who decided that $50 was worth more than a stranger's life. But the notice also changed Elowen in the eyes of the brothers. She was no longer a victim they had rescued. She was evidence. She was justice waiting to happen. And keeping her alive was no longer just an act of compassion. It was an act of war against the kind of men who burned women with cigars and sold them like cattle, and put up notices calling them dangerous when the only danger they posed was to the men who had hurt them. 7 days after Nolan found the notice, the Reverend Aldrich Pugh arrived at the Dunhill cabin with 10 men behind him. They came on horseback, strung out along the trail in a loose column, their breath rising in white columns in the cold morning air. They were not armed for war. Most of them carried only the sidearms they wore every day, but they were armed for intimidation, which was Pugh's preferred weapon. The Reverend sat at the front of the group on his gray mare, his Bible visible in his saddlebag, his face set in an expression of sorrowful determination that he had practiced in the mirror before riding out. The three Dunhill brothers stood on the porch of their cabin. Rowan in the center, arms crossed over his chest. Beckett on his left, his hand resting on his belt near the handle of his hunting knife, his weight shifted forward on the balls of his feet. Nolan on the right, his usual warmth replaced by something cold and still, the quiet before a storm that the other two brothers had rarely seen in him. Inside the cabin, behind the half-closed door, Elowen stood with her back against the wall and Nolan's pocket knife in her hand. She was not hiding. She was waiting. Dunhill Pugh began, his voice carrying across the frozen air with the projection of a man accustomed to addressing congregations. "We've come to talk sense. The situation here cannot continue. An unmarried woman living with 3 unmarried men is an offense to every standard of decency this community holds dear. And now there's a notice out, a reward. This girl may be a fugitive, and you may be harboring her." Rowan let him finish. He let the silence that followed stretch out long enough for every man in the group to feel the weight of what they were doing, riding up to another man's home to tell him how to live. Then he spoke, and his voice was the voice of a man who had commanded other men in battle and had learned that volume was weakness and certainty was strength. This woman was kidnapped by a man named Crosby Phelps. She was held for 2 weeks. She was beaten. She was burned. She was going to be sold. That notice was written by the man who did it, and it's a lie from the first word to the last. If you want to hand her over to the people who put that notice up, you're welcome to try. But you'll come through the 3 of us first. Silence. The horses shifted. The wind blew. And then a voice came from the middle of the group, a voice that every man in the column recognized, and the recognition carried weight because the voice belonged to a man who held half their debts in a ledger behind his store counter. Olin Carvey pushed his horse forward, emerging from the group like a rock surfacing from a retreating tide. His face was difficult to read. He was not smiling. He was not angry. He was something more complicated than either. "I don't like this business," Olin said, and his voice carried the authority of a man who was owed money by most of the people present. "I don't like it one bit. But 30 years ago, my wife came out here on a stage from Philadelphia. Mail-order bride. She didn't know a soul west of the Mississippi. She showed up in a town full of strangers who looked at her the same way you all are looking at that girl in there." He paused, and in the pause, something in his hard old face shifted, a crack in the stone that revealed for just a moment the grief underneath. "If someone had told me she was kidnapped, I'd have wanted to hear the whole story before I dragged her off somebody's porch. I expect the same courtesy now." The effect was immediate. Olin Carvey was not a man people disagreed with lightly. He held mortgages and tabs and IOUs. He was the economic center of Bitterroot Crossing, and his word carried the weight of coin. The men in the group exchanged glances. Pugh opened his mouth to reassert his position, but the ground had shifted beneath him, and he could feel it. One by one, the men in the column turned their horses. Not in retreat, not exactly, but in the particular direction change of men who have decided that this particular hill is not worth dying on today. Pugh was the last to go. He held Rowan's gaze for a long moment, and in his eyes was not defeat but patience. The patience of a man who believed that God was on his side and that God, unlike a shopkeeper, never changed his mind. When the column had disappeared down the trail, Rowan stood on the porch and let out a breath he had been holding since the first horse appeared on the ridgeline. Behind him, the cabin door opened and Elowen stepped out. She stood beside him, not touching, but close enough that he could feel the warmth of her through the cold air between them. "It won't be the last time," she said. "No," he agreed, "it won't." That night, with Beckett on patrol and Nolan asleep, Elowen and Rowan sat alone by the stove. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across the plank floor. She asked him a question no one had asked him in 9 years. Have you ever been afraid? Rowan was quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet that is not empty, but full of things being considered and weighed and tested against the truth before being spoken. In the war, he said finally, I was afraid every day, afraid of dying, afraid of killing. But the thing I was most afraid of, and here his voice dropped not in volume but in register, as if the words were coming from a deeper place, was when I stopped being afraid, when killing became easy, when I looked at a dead man and felt nothing. I thought I'd lost the ability to feel, forever. Elowen watched him. The firelight moved across his face, revealing and concealing. And now he turned to her, and his amber eyes held a rawness she had not seen in them before, a vulnerability that must have cost him more than she could imagine to show. Now I'm afraid of losing what I just found again. She understood. She had always understood from the first morning she woke in his cabin and saw the coffee on the table and knew that someone had risen before dawn to make it for her. She raised her hand and placed it against his cheek, hesitant at first, then steady. His skin was warm and rough with stubble, and she could feel the tension in his jaw, the effort it took for him to hold still, to not pull away, to let himself be touched by someone who was not trying to hurt him. She leaned closer. The kiss, when it came, was slow and uncertain, the way first kisses between damaged people always are, carrying the weight of every reason it should not happen and the single stubborn reason it should. When they parted, her forehead rested against his and her breath was quick in the space between them. You treat me as if I'm not broken, she whispered. His hand rose to her back, steady and sure. Because you're not. And they stayed close, foreheads touching, breathing together, while the fire crackled down to embers. It was not a declaration. It was not a promise. It was something more fragile and more honest than either. It was two people who had been alone for a very long time, acknowledging without fanfare and without certainty that they did not want to be alone anymore. The fire burned out. The cold pressed in. And outside, the world continued to assemble its forces against them. 6 days later, Harlan Oakes rode into Bitterroot Crossing. He came in the late afternoon when the light was going flat and the shadows stretched long across the muddy main street. He tied his horse at the saloon rail, a big roan gelding with a mean eye, and walked through the swinging doors with the unhurried confidence of a man who had been in 100 towns like this one and feared none of them. Two men followed him, nondescript, armed, the kind of men who blended into the woodwork of any frontier saloon until the moment they drew their weapons. Harlan ordered whiskey and drank it standing at the bar, his eyes moving over the room with the practiced assessment of a professional hunter evaluating terrain. He was lean and hard, his face marked by a scar that ran from his left temple to the corner of his jaw, the souvenir of a knife fight in a mining camp 3 years ago. He did not smile. Men like Harlan Oakes did not waste energy on expressions that served no tactical purpose. He asked the bartender about a girl. Young blonde, might have been hurt, might have been taken in by someone in the area. He asked the way he asked everything, quietly, with cash on the bar and patience in his voice, and something in his eyes that made the bartender answer quickly and honestly. Don't know about no girl, the bartender said, polishing a glass with a rag that was dirtier than the glass. But the Dunhill brothers from on the mountain, they brought a woman into town a couple weeks back. Whole place has been talking about it. A miner at the end of the bar, drunk enough to be brave and stupid enough to be helpful, leaned over. 3 big boys live up past the timberline, got themselves a little blonde thing. Reverend Pugh's been raising hell about it. Harlan did not smile, but something in his eyes shifted, a sharpening, a focusing, the look of a predator that has been tracking scent for days and has just felt the wind change in its favor. He laid another coin on the bar and walked out into the fading light. Across the street, behind the curtained window of the Stratton boarding house, Dorinda Stratton watched him go. She had been watching since he tied his horse, and she had known from the moment he walked into the saloon with that purposeful stride and those cold, flat eyes exactly what kind of man he was. She had married that kind of man once. She had buried that kind of man 4 years later when his horse threw him into a ravine, and she had never once visited the grave. She went to the back room where her son Milo was doing arithmetic at the kitchen table. Milo was 12 small for his age, but quick and brave in the particular way that children who have grown up watching their mothers survive are brave. She knelt beside him, took his face in her hands, and spoke clearly. There's a man at the saloon, bad man. He's looking for the woman up at the Dunhill cabin. I need you to ride up there tonight and tell them. Can you do that? Milo nodded without hesitation. Take the back trail, the one through the aspens. Don't stop for anything. If you hear hooves behind you, ride harder. The boy was on his horse and out the back gate before the last light left the sky. Harlan, meanwhile, had found his way to the white-clapboard house beside the church where Reverend Aldrich Pugh kept his study. He knocked with the courtesy of a man who understood that certain doors required knocking, and Pugh opened it with the wariness of a man who was not accustomed to visitors after dark. Reverend, Harlan said, removing his hat. His voice was polished, deferential, carefully modulated to match the expectations of a clergyman. My name is Harlan Oakes. I represent the family of a young woman who we believe may be in this area. She left home some weeks ago under distressing circumstances, and her family is deeply concerned for her welfare. I understand she may have been taken in by some men on the mountain. Pugh studied him. The scar on the man's face was unsettling, but his words were proper, his tone respectful, and his story aligned perfectly with what Pugh already believed, that the woman in the Dunhill cabin was an aberration that needed to be corrected. The Reverend did not ask for proof. He did not ask for the family's name. He did not ask why a man with a knife scar and mercenary's eyes had been chosen as the family's representative. These questions would have complicated the narrative that Pugh had already constructed, and Aldrich Pugh was not a man who welcomed complications to his narratives. He gave Harlan directions to the Dunhill cabin, trail markings, distances, landmarks. He described the approach, the layout, the position of the woodworking shed relative to the main structure. He did it with the satisfied expression of a man who believed he was facilitating a reunion rather than enabling a murder. When Harlan left, tipping his hat politely, Pugh closed his door and returned to his study and his Bible and his unshakable conviction that he had done the right thing. He would discover in the weeks to come what the right thing had actually cost. But on this night, in the warmth of his study, with the certainty of his righteousness wrapped around him like a blanket, Aldrich Pugh slept well. Miles above the town, climbing the mountain trail under a moon that turned the snow to blue silver, Milo Stratton rode with his head down and his heart hammering. Behind him in the saloon, Harlan Oakes sat at a corner table and drew a knife from his boot and laid it on the wood and began to clean it, with slow, careful strokes, the way a man cleans a tool he expects to use soon. In the cabin at the top of the world, Elowen sat by the stove and sewed the last button onto a shirt she had mended for Rowan. She bit the threads, smoothed the fabric, and held it up to the firelight to check her work. The button was secure. The stitches were invisible. The shirt was whole again. She folded it and set it on the table and looked at the fire, and for a moment, just a moment, she let herself believe that she was safe, that the cabin on the mountain was beyond the reach of the world that had tried to destroy her, that the three men who lived here would hold the walls against whatever came. The moment lasted until the sound of hooves reached the cabin. Fast hooves, desperate hooves, the hooves of a horse being ridden by a boy who was too scared to slow down. And in the sound of those hooves, Elowen heard the truth she had always known, the truth she had tried to outrun through 2 days of snow and 2 weeks of healing and one slow, devastating kiss by a dying fire. The world was not done with her. The world was never done with people like her. It simply paused, caught its breath, and came again. She set down the shirt. She stood up, and she did not run. The boy came through the door like a bullet. Milo Stratton, 12 years old, 80 pounds, soaking wet, his face the color of candle wax, and his chest heaving so hard that his first 3 attempts at speech produced nothing but steam and gasping. His horse outside was blowing foam, its sides dark with sweat despite the freezing air, and the sound it made, the labored wheeze of an animal pushed past its limits, was the first thing that brought all 3 Dunhill brothers to their feet. Nolan reached the boy first. He guided Milo to the chair by the stove, put a cup of water in his shaking hands, and waited with the patience of a man who understood that panic had its own timeline and could not be hurried. Beckett stood near the door, his hand already on the hunting knife at his belt, his body angled toward the darkness outside, as if he could hear the danger coming through the trees. Rowan stood in the center of the room, still as a post, his amber eyes fixed on the boy's face, reading the fear there, the way he had once read terrain maps in the field, looking for the information that would determine whether men lived or died. 3 men, Milo managed between breaths. At the saloon, asking about Miss Elowen. One of them has a scar, long one down his face. He swallowed hard, his throat working. Ma said they're bad. Said I had to ride up here and tell you right now. The cabin went silent. Not the comfortable silence of evenings by the stove, but the compressed silence of a room in which every person has just heard the same thing and is calculating what it means. Rowan spoke first. Not to Milo, not to his brothers, but to the silence itself, as if he were confirming something he had always known was coming. How many horses? 3, Milo said. Big horses, trail horses. They had rifles on the saddles. Rowan nodded once slow. His mind had already shifted into the mode that the war had built into him. The cold analytical machinery that stripped emotion from calculation and turned fear into planning. 3 men, armed on good horses. They knew where the cabin was, or they would know by morning, because a town like Bitterroot Crossing could not keep a secret any longer than it took for a drunk to open his mouth or a righteous man to point the way. He looked at his brothers. No words were necessary. They had lived together for 5 years in the kind of proximity that turns brothers into a single organism with 3 bodies and 1 instinct. Beckett was already moving toward the gun rack on the far wall, pulling down the second Winchester, checking the action feeding shells into the magazine with the mechanical precision of a man who had done it 10,000 times. Nolan went to the shelf where he kept his medical supplies and began laying out bandages, needle and thread, the jar of bear grease, the small brown bottle of laudanum he saved for emergencies. He was preparing for the worst because preparing for the worst was what Nolan did, and because the worst, in his experience, had a habit of arriving precisely when you thought you were ready for it. Lowen stood by the stove. She had not moved since the boy came through the door, but she had not frozen either. She stood with her hands at her sides, her back straight, her green eyes moving from face to face with an expression that was not panic but assessment. She was measuring the situation the way she measured fabric, precisely, quickly, looking for the place where the cut needed to be made. "If I leave now," she said, and her voice was steady in a way that surprised even her, "they'll follow me. You'll be safe." The room stopped. And then Beckett turned from the gun rack, a Winchester in each hand, and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not wariness, not the guarded suspicion that had defined their relationship since the day Rowan carried her through the door. Something else entirely. Something that looked like a man who had just realized that the wall he had built around himself had a door in it and someone had walked through without asking permission, and he could not bring himself to push them back out. "You walk out that door," Beckett said, his voice low and rough and absolute. "I drag you back in. You understand me?" It was the most words Beckett Dunhill had ever spoken to her at one time. It was also, in his particular language of bluntness and force, the most tender thing he had ever said to anyone. He was not declaring affection. He was declaring membership. She was family. She was inside the wall. And Beckett Dunhill did not let family walk into the dark alone. Rowan stepped forward, his jaw set like iron. "You're not going anywhere, John." He turned to Nolan. "The boy needs to rest, then ride home before dawn. Beckett, I need trip lines on the north and east approaches. Wire and tin cans, same as we set for the Grizzly 2 winters back. Nolan, get the cabin ready." "For what?" Nolan asked, though he already knew. "For whatever comes through those trees in the morning." They worked through the night with the efficiency of men who had survived by preparation rather than luck. Rowan walked the perimeter of the clearing around the cabin, identifying sight lines and cover positions, and the places where a man on horseback could approach without being seen until he was too close to miss. He positioned himself mentally at each point, calculating angles of fire distances to the door, the time it would take to move from the porch to the woodworking shed to the horse corral. The war had taught him that every piece of ground told you how to defend it if you listened. This ground said funnel them. The cabin sat at the head of a narrow clearing with dense timber on 3 sides and a granite shelf on the 4th. There were only 2 natural approaches, the main trail from the south and a game path that came in from the east through a stand of young aspens. Everything else was too thick with deadfall and snow to ride through quickly. Beckett set his trip lines with the practiced hands of a man who had been trapping since boyhood. Wire stretched ankle-high between trees, threaded through the handles of tin cans filled with pebbles. Not lethal, not meant to be, meant to make noise, to turn a silent approach into an announced one, to steal the advantage of surprise from men who counted on it. He worked in the dark without a lantern, navigating by memory and moonlight, his breath steady, his movements sure. For the first time in weeks, Beckett Dunhill felt entirely himself. The uncertainty, the emotional complexity, the slow, confusing process of learning to care about someone new. All of it fell away in the clarity of purpose. Someone was coming to hurt a person under his protection. The response to that was simple. The response to that was the one thing Beckett had always been good at. Nolan transformed the cabin into a field hospital. He cleared the table and covered it with the cleanest cloth they had. He laid out his instruments, such as they were a needle thread, a small, sharp knife, bandages torn from an old shirt. He filled the kettle and set it on the stove to boil. He checked the laudanum bottle, tilting it to the light to see how much remained. Not much, enough for one serious wound, maybe two, if they were small. He placed it beside the bandages and tried not to think about which of his brothers might need it. In the small hours before dawn, when the preparations were finished and Milo had been sent home on a rested horse with instructions to stay inside and bar the doors, Elowen sat by the window with the revolver Nolan had given her resting on her lap. She had never held a gun before 3 weeks ago. Nolan had shown her the basics during their afternoon lessons: how to cock the hammer, how to sight along the short barrel, how to squeeze the trigger rather than pulling it. She had fired it twice into a snowbank, hitting nothing in particular, and Nolan had said, "We'll work on aim," with the cheerful optimism of a man who believed that any skill could be taught with enough patience. She looked at the gun, now small and heavy in her hands, and thought about the last time she had been this afraid. In the cellar at Garrow Station in the dark, with the sound of men's boots overhead, and the smell of damp earth, and the weight of knowing that no one in the world knew where she was, and no one was coming to help. She had been afraid then with the blind, animal fear of a creature in a cage. She was afraid now with something different. She was afraid for the men sleeping around her, the men who had taken her in and fed her and given her warmth and asked for nothing, and who were about to put themselves between her and the violence that had followed her across the mountains. Rowan sat down beside her. The fire had burned to embers, and the cabin was lit only by the faint gray light that comes before dawn, the light that is not yet morning but is no longer night. "If the worst happens," Elowen said, and Rowan started to speak, but she stopped him with a hand on his arm, firm and certain. "Let me finish. If the worst happens, Crosby Phelps runs his operation out of Garrow Station, southwest of here. The women are kept in a cellar beneath the horse barn. Stone walls, one door padlocked from outside. There are at least 3 women still down there. Their names are Sarah and Bonnie, and a girl who only told us her first name was Ruth. Someone has to know this, in case I can't tell them myself." Rowan looked at her hand on his arm, then at her face. In the gray light, her green eyes were darker, deeper, the color of pine needles in shadow. He covered her hand with his own. "You'll tell the judge yourself," he said, "in person. Standing on your own 2 feet, I'll make sure of it." She held his gaze, and something passed between them that was bigger than words and quieter than promises. Then the first light broke over the eastern ridge, and the day began. They came at dawn. 3 riders emerging from the timber on the south trail, moving at a walk, their horses picking through the crusted snow with the careful steps of animals that had been ridden hard and were being saved for what came next. The lead rider was Harlan Oakes, sitting easy in the saddle, his coat open despite the cold, his scar a pale line against the weathered darkness of his face. The 2 men behind him spread out as they entered the clearing, one angling left or toward the woodworking shed, the other drifting right toward the horse corral, creating a triangle of approach that covered the cabin from 3 directions. Professional, deliberate. These were not angry townsmen on a moral crusade. These were men who killed for wages and understood the geometry of enlèvements. Harlan stopped his horse 30 yards from the cabin porch and raised his voice, pitching it to carry without shouting. A calm voice, a reasonable voice. The voice of a man who preferred efficiency over drama. "Dunhill, I'm here for the girl. Send her out, and nobody has to get hurt today. I got no quarrel with you or your brothers. This is business." Rowan stood on the porch. The Winchester was in his hands, held across his body, not aimed but ready, the way a man holds a weapon when he wants you to know it is there without wanting you to feel threatened enough to start shooting before he is ready. His voice came back flat and hard, carrying the absolute certainty of a man who had decided what he was willing to die for, and had made his peace with the price. She stays. Turn your horses around. Don't come back. Harlan tilted his head, considering. He had expected this. Men who took in strays always got attached. It was predictable and, in Harlan's professional assessment, manageable. He had 3 guns to their 3 better positioning since his men were spread, while the brothers were clustered on the porch, and the advantage of being willing to kill without hesitation, which was not something most men could match, regardless of how angry they were. He smiled, not with warmth, with calculation. Last chance, Dunhill. Rowan did not answer. His thumb found the hammer of the Winchester. The world held its breath. The first sound was not a gunshot. It was tin cans, a cascade of metallic rattling from the east side of the clearing, where Beckett's tripwire crossed the game trail. The man who'd been circling toward the horse corral had hit the wire, and the cans exploded into noise, shattering the silence with a racket that echoed off the granite shelf behind the cabin and sent a shower of snow falling from the pine branches overhead. Beckett fired from the woodworking shed. He had positioned himself there before dawn, belly down behind the split log pile with the Winchester resting on a chunk of oak, the barrel trained on the eastern approach. When the cans rattled and the man stumbled, fighting to keep his footing and draw his weapon at the same time, Beckett squeezed the trigger with the patience and precision of a man who had been shooting game in these mountains for 5 years and had never missed anything he intended to hit. The shot took the man in the shoulder, not the head, not the chest, not a kill shot, because Rowan had said in the dark planning hours of the night, "Wound if you can, kill if you must, but I want them alive to stand trial." The man spun with the impact, his revolver flying from his grip, and dropped into the snow, clutching his shoulder, his scream cutting through the morning air. Everything happened at once. Harlan drew and fired it from horseback, his first shot chewing a chunk of wood from the porch railing 6 inches from Rowan's hip. Rowan dropped to one knee and returned fire, the Winchester cracking twice, both shots punching into the tree trunk. Harlan dove behind as his horse bolted sideways. The second hired man on the west side opened fire on the cabin window's glass and wood splinters spraying inward, and Nolan, positioned inside by the back door, fired through the shattered window frame, forcing the man to duck behind the water barrel at the corner of the horse corral. The noise was immense, echoing off the mountain walls, the sharp crack of rifles layered over the deeper boom of pistol shots, the whinnying of panicked horses, the shouts of men adjusting positions. For Rowan, the sound unlocked a door he had kept sealed for 9 years. The war came back, not as memory but as muscle, as instinct, as the particular clarity of mind that descends on certain men in combat, the clarity that burns away fear and doubt and hesitation and leaves only the pure mechanics of survival. He worked the lever of the Winchester and fired again, keeping Harlan pinned behind the tree, then rolled off the porch into the snow and came up in a crouch behind the chopping block. From this position, he could cover both the south approach and the west side of the cabin. He fired twice more at the tree, not to hit Harlan, but to keep him honest, to keep his head down, to buy time for whatever was happening on the other sides of the clearing. Beckett had moved. The moment after his first shot, he had rolled from behind the log pile and sprinted through the timber, circling east, coming around behind the man he had wounded. The man was trying to crawl toward his dropped revolver, leaving a dark trail in the snow. Beckett reached the gun first, kicked it into the trees, and pressed the barrel of his Winchester against the back of the man's head. "Stay down." 2 words. The man stayed down. On the west side, Nolan was in trouble. The second hired man had recovered from his initial surprise and was working his way along the horse corral fence using the post for cover, moving toward the back door of the cabin. Nolan fired twice through the window, but the angle was bad, and the shots went wide, thudding into fence posts. The man reached the corner of the cabin and pressed his back against the log wall out of Nolan's line of fire and began to edge toward the back door. Nolan moved to intercept, positioning himself inside the door with the revolver raised. When the man came around the corner and reached for the latch, Nolan kicked the door open into his face. The heavy timber caught the man full across the forehead, snapping his head back, and Nolan was on him before he hit the ground, driving the butt of the revolver into the man's temple. The hired man went limp, his unfired weapon falling into the mud. That left Harlan, and Harlan had not survived 15 years as a mercenary by staying pinned behind a tree while his men were neutralized. The moment Rowan shifted position to check on the west side of the clearing, Harlan moved. He was faster than a man his size should have been, sprinting from behind the tree, not toward the porch, but around the side of the cabin, toward the front door, which had been left half open for Elowin to hear what was happening outside. He hit the door with his shoulder and burst through. The cabin was dark after the brightness of the snow outside, and it took his eyes a half-second to adjust. Half a second was too long. Elowin stood in the center of the room. She was not hiding behind furniture. She was not cowering in a corner. She was standing in the open, her feet planted, her arms extended. Nolan's small revolver held in both hands, the barrel pointed at the center of Harlan Oakes' chest. Her hands were shaking. Her face was white. But her eyes, those green eyes that had opened in this same room 3 weeks ago, full of animal terror, were absolutely steady. Harlan stopped. He looked at her, at the gun, at the shaking hands, and something that might have been amusement crossed his scarred face. "You don't know how to shoot, sweetheart. Put that down before you hurt yourself." Elowin looked at him, and she saw everything. She saw the cellar at Garrow Station, the stone walls, the padlocked donk door. She saw the other women, Sarah and Bonnie and Ruth, their faces in the dark. She saw his hands, these hands, the ones that had held her arms, while Phelps pressed the burning cigar into her shoulder. She saw the 2 days of snow, the crawling, the cold that ate into her bones the moment she closed her eyes and gave up. She saw all of it in the time it took to draw one breath. And in that breath, the fear that had lived inside her since the stagecoach arrived at Garrow Station, and she saw that there was no groom, no house, no life waiting, only a fat man with cold eyes and a cellar full of women. That fear did not disappear. It did not transform into courage, because courage is what people call fear, or after it has been survived, and she had not survived this yet. What happened was simpler and harder than courage. The fear moved. It shifted from the center of her chest, where it had been sitting like a stone for weeks, to somewhere behind her, somewhere she could feel it, but it could no longer control her hands. And in the space the fear left behind, something else moved in, not bravery, rage. The cold, patient, bone-deep rage of a woman who had been treated like property and marked like cattle and left to die in the snow, and who was not under any circumstances going to let it happen again. Not to her, not to Sarah, not to Bonnie, not to Ruth. She pulled the trigger. The shot was not clean. It hit Harlan in the right shoulder instead of the chest, spinning him sideways, his own weapon discharging into the floor as his arm jerked with the impact. He staggered but did not go down, reaching for the doorframe to steady himself, his eyes wide with the particular surprise of a man who has just been shot by someone he dismissed. Rowan came through the door behind him. The butt of the Winchester connected with the base of Harlan's skull, with a sound like an axe hitting green wood, and Harlan Oakes collapsed face first onto the plank floor and did not move. Silence. The ringing, buzzing silence that follows gunfire when the world seems to hold its breath to see if there will be more. Then Rowan looked at Elowin. She still held the revolver, her arms extended, the barrel now pointed at the space where Harlan had been standing. Her hands had stopped shaking. Her face was still white, but her jaw was set and her eyes were clear and dry. She was not crying. She was not breaking down. She was standing exactly where she had planted herself, and she was breathing, and she was alive, and the man on the floor was not going to hurt anyone ever again. "Elowin, Rowan said, soft, just her name. She lowered the gun, her arms dropped to her sides, and then she looked at him, and in the green of her eyes held something he recognized from the war. Something he had seen in the faces of men after their first battle. The particular expression of someone who has discovered what they are capable of and is not entirely sure how to feel about it. "I'm all right," she said, and she meant it not as a statement of physical condition, but as a declaration of identity. She was all right. She was standing. She was not broken. Outside, Beckett's voice cut through the morning air. "Rowan over here." Rowan ran to the east side of the clearing and found Beckett sitting on the ground with his back against the woodworking shed, his right hand clamped over his left arm just above the elbow. Blood seeped between his fingers, dark and steady, soaking into the sleeve of his shirt and dripping onto the snow in a pattern that made Rowan's stomach drop before his mind caught up with the assessment. The second hired man, the one on the west side, had gotten off a shot during his approach to the back door that Rowan had not heard over the noise of his own firing. The bullet had caught Beckett in the meat of the upper arm, passing through cleanly, but tearing muscle as it went. "It's nothing," Beckett said through his teeth, his face gray with pain, but his voice carrying the stubborn irritation of a man who considered his own injury a personal insult. "Went through, didn't hit bone." Nolan appeared from around the corner of the cabin, his medical supplies already in his hands, and dropped to his knees beside his brother with the focused calm that had become the defining characteristic of the youngest Dunhill. He cut the sleeve away, examined the wound, cleaned it with water from the canteen, and began to wrap it with bandages that he had prepared hours ago for exactly this possibility. His hands were steady, his face was not. Elowen came out of the cabin and saw Beckett on the ground, Nolan pressing cloth to the wound, blood on the snow. She crossed the clearing at a run and knelt beside them without hesitation, her hands, the seamstress hands, the healing hands that Nolan had trained, taking the edge of the bandage and holding it tight while Nolan wrapped. She worked quickly, precisely, her fingers finding the right pressure by instinct. And Beckett, who was clenching his jaw so hard that the muscles stood out like cables along his neck, looked at her and managed 4 words through the pain. "Told you. Not bad." Elowen laughed. It came out broken, a half laugh and half sob, the sound of relief and terror and exhaustion, and something that might have been joy all compressed into a single ragged breath. She held the bandage tight against his arm and did not let go. Rowan stood back and watched the three of them. Elowen kneeling beside Beckett, helping Nolan stop the bleeding, her honey blonde hair falling across her face, her hands red with his brother's blood. And in that image, in the simple, brutal fact of a woman who had come to them half dead and who was now on her knees in the mud helping to save the life of the man who had wanted to send her away, Rowan Dunhill understood something that 5 years of isolation and 9 years of war had tried to beat out of him. Family was not blood. Family was not obligation. Family was the people who got on their knees in the dirt for you when the world was trying to take you apart. Family was a choice made in the worst moment, under the most pressure, when walking away was easiest and staying was hardest. Family was this: a woman with a gun she barely knew how to use, standing between a killer and the people who had given her a home. A man with a bullet in his arm refusing to admit that it mattered, because admitting it mattered would mean admitting that he was vulnerable, and admitting he was vulnerable would mean admitting that the woman bandaging his wound had gotten past the wall, and the wall was the only thing that had kept him standing for 31 years. Family was this, and Rowan was not going to let anyone take it. They brought the 3 men down to Bitterroot Crossing, tied across their saddles like sacks of grain. Harlan Oakes regained consciousness during the ride, but did not speak, his scarred face pressed against the horse's flank, his eyes open and calculating, and already beginning to construct the story he would tell to whoever would listen. The 2 hired men were less stoic. One moaned steadily through the miles. The other stared at the passing trees with the blank expression of a man who was reconsidering his career choices. The town came out to watch. They lined the main street, men and women and children, their faces showing the full spectrum of small-town reaction to extraordinary events. Curiosity, shock, vindication, shame. A few of the men who had ridden with Pugh to the Dunhill cabin looked at the bound prisoners and then looked at their own boots, and in the space between those 2 glances, something important happened. They began to wonder whether they had been on the right side. The circuit judge was a man named Halstead, 62 years old, with a white beard and eyes that had seen everything the frontier could produce and had stopped being surprised by any of it approximately 20 years ago. He held court in the back room of the saloon because it was the largest enclosed space in town, and he listened to testimony with the patience of a man who understood that justice, like whiskey, should never be rushed. Elowen testified. She stood before the judge in the dress Dory Stratton had given her, her honey blonde hair pulled back in a simple braid, her hands folded in front of her back straight as a rifle barrel. She spoke for 20 minutes, and in those 20 minutes, she did not falter, did not cry, did not look away from the judge's eyes. She told him everything: the advertisement in the Boston newspaper, the stagecoach ride west, the arrival at Garrow Station, and the discovery that there was no groom, no house, no life waiting. Only Crosby Phelps and his men and a cellar beneath the horse barn. She told him about the other women: Sarah, who was 26 and had come from Ohio; Bonnie, who was 19 and had come from Virginia; Ruth, who would not tell anyone her last name or her age, but who cried in her sleep every night. She told him about the 2 weeks, the locked door, the darkness, the men who came and went, the burns. She pulled her collar aside and showed the judge the round scar on her left shoulder, And the room went silent with the particular silence of people who are seeing something that will change how they think about the world. She told him about the escape, the fight between Phelps's men over money, the unlocked door, 2 days in the snow, walking until she could not walk, crawling, until she could not crawl, lying down in the lee of a fallen pine, and closing her eyes and waiting for the cold to finish what the men had started. And she told him about waking up in a cabin on a mountain, surrounded by 3 men she had never met, with a knife in her hand and fear in her heart, and how those 3 men had fed her and healed her and taught her to split wood and set traps and sew wounds and fire a gun, and how they had stood on their porch and faced down a mob of their own neighbors rather than let her be taken, and how one of them had taken a bullet in the arm protecting her, and how she had stood in the middle of their cabin and fired a revolver at a man who had come to drag her back to hell, and she would do it again, she said, looking the judge directly in the eyes. She would do it again every day for the rest of her life, if that was what it took to make sure no other woman ended up in that cellar. Judge Halstead issued the warrant for Crosby Phelps that afternoon. Federal marshals rode for Garrow Station the next morning. They found the cellar exactly where Elowin said it would be, beneath the horse barn stone walls, one door padlocked from outside. They found 3 women inside, Sarah and Bonnie and Ruth. They found ledgers in Phelps's office documenting transactions that would have turned the stomach of a butcher. Crosby Phelps was arrested at his desk, his face red with indignation, his mouth full of denials that no one believed. The news traveled back to Bitterroot Crossing in stages, each stage adding another layer of reality to what Elowin had testified. The town absorbed the information the way soil absorbs rain, slowly, unevenly, with some patches going soft and others remaining hard. But absorption happened regardless, and what grew from it was change. Olin Carvey was the first. The day after Elowin's testimony, when she came into his store with Nolan to buy supplies, Olin did something he had never done for any customer in 30 years of business. He came out from behind the counter, walked to where a bolt of good cotton fabric sat on the shelf, quality stuff from back east, with a floral print that he had been saving for a buyer who could afford his markup, and he set it on the counter in front of her. New shipment, he said, which was a lie since the fabric had been there for 6 months. Thought you might need it. Elowin looked at the fabric, then at Olin. She understood the language. In a town like Bitterroot Crossing, generosity was not expressed through speeches. It was expressed through gestures, through the quiet recalibration of how one person treated another, through the offer of good fabric at no charge from a man who charged for everything. A week later, Olin pulled Rowan aside while Elowin was examining thread at the back of the store. His voice was low, rough, stripped of its usual commercial precision. "My wife," he said, and the word came out with a weight that surprised both of them. She came out here on a stage from Philadelphia. 1851. Mail-order bride. She didn't know a living soul between here and the ocean. I almost let her get back on that stage because I was afraid of what people would say, afraid of what they'd think of a man who had to send away for a wife. He stopped. His jaw worked. His eyes, those small, shrewd, calculating eyes, were bright with something that was not calculation. "Stupidest thing I almost did in my entire life. Glad I didn't." He walked back behind the counter and did not mention it again. But from that day forward, Olin Carvey treated Elowin Ashby with the particular respect of a man who saw in her the ghost of someone he had loved and lost and never stopped missing. Dory Stratton became Elowin's first real friend, the first friendship Elowin had ever had that was not built on necessity or survival, but on the simple human pleasure of being known. They were alike in ways that went deeper than circumstance. Both had been shaped by violence. Both had survived by stubbornness rather than luck. Both had emerged from their respective crucibles with a quality that men often mistook for softness, but that was in truth the particular hardness of metal that has been heated and hammered and cooled and heated again until it cannot be broken by anything short of destruction itself. They met on Thursday afternoons at the boarding house, drinking tea that Dory brewed from dried mint she had grown the summer before, and they talked about everything, about nothing, about the weather and the price of flour, and the way Milo was growing so fast he needed new boots every 3 months. And sometimes when the light was fading and the tea had gone cold and the conversation had found its way to the deeper currents, they talked about the things that had been done to them by men who were supposed to protect them. They did not cry when they talked about these things. They had both cried enough, Instead, they spoke with the matter-of-fact clarity of women who had looked at the worst of what the world could do and decided to keep living anyway. Aldrich Pugh discovered the cost of his complicity in increments. No one confronted him, no one accused him publicly, no one nailed a letter to his church door or stood in his congregation and pointed a finger. What happened was quieter and more devastating than any of those things. People simply stopped coming. Not all at once, not dramatically. One family at a time, one Sunday at a time, the pews grew emptier and the hymns grew thinner and the collection plate grew lighter. People nodded to him on the street but did not stop to talk. They smiled when they saw him, but the smiles did not reach their eyes. He was not shunned. He was simply set aside the way a town sets aside a tool that has proven unreliable, not thrown away, but placed on a shelf where it will not be reached for again. The knowledge of what he had done giving directions to the Dunhill cabin to a man who turned out to be a hired killer seeped through the town like groundwater. Invisible but everywhere. No one spoke of it directly because direct speech would have required direct confrontation, and small towns prefer their judgments to be delivered through silence and exclusion rather than accusation. But everyone knew. Everyone. And Pugh knew that everyone knew. And in that knowing, the Reverend who had built his identity on moral authority discovered what it felt like to have that authority revoked not by argument or challenge, but by the quiet collective decision of a community that had weighed his righteousness against his actions and found it wanting. He did not leave Bitterroot Crossing. He continued to open his church each Sunday and deliver his sermons to the diminishing faithful. But the fire was gone from his voice, and the certainty was gone from his eyes. And the man who had ridden up to the Dunhill cabin with 10 men at his back, and the conviction of God in his heart, was gone, entirely replaced by a smaller, quieter man who locked his study door in the evenings and sat in the dark and wondered whether God had been speaking to him at all, or whether the voice he had been listening to all along had been his own. Spring came the way spring comes to the mountains, not all at once, but in degrees. Each degree a small victory over the winter that had held the land in its grip for 5 months. The snow softened. The creek behind the cabin, silent since November, began to murmur, then to chatter, then to roar with the accumulated meltwater of an entire winter snowfall. The ground turned from white to brown, to the first tentative green, and the air, which had been a weapon for months, became a gift carrying the smell of wet earth and pine sap and the indefinable sweetness of things coming back to life. The cabin changed with the season. Rowan and his brothers began the spring work of fencing and planting, expanding the cleared ground around the cabin, preparing for a garden that would feed 4 people instead of 3. Elowen joined them, and the work transformed her in ways that the healing had only begun. She learned to ride taught by Beckett, whose wounded arm had healed to a thick scar that he displayed with a pride that baffled everyone except Elowen, who understood that for Beckett, the scar was proof that he had bled for something that mattered. She learned to set traps and read tracks and identify the edible plants that grew along the creek bank. She learned to shoot properly, taught by Nolan on long afternoons, firing at tin cans balanced on fence posts until she could hit 3 out of 5 at 20 paces, and then 4 out of 5, and then on one memorable afternoon that Nolan insisted on marking with a notch on the cabin doorpost 5 out of 5. Her body changed. The gaunt sharpness of starvation and fear softened into the lean strength of a woman who spent her days in physical labor. Her shoulders squared, her step firmed. The scar on her shoulder remained round and pale against her skin, but she no longer covered it, no longer flinched when the collar of her dress shifted and revealed it. It was not a mark of what had been done to her. It was a mark of what she had survived. And the difference between those two things was the distance Elowen Ashby had traveled since the morning she opened her eyes in a stranger's cabin and picked up a knife. One evening after supper, with the dishes cleared and the lamp lit, and the 4 of them settled into the positions that had become as natural as breathing, Nolan reading Beckett, cleaning a trap, Elowen mending, Rowan sitting in his chair by the window, watching the last light leave the mountains. Rowan placed something on the table in front of Elowen, a ring, silver thin, simple, polished to a quiet shine by years of wear on a woman's hand. His mother's ring, the only thing he had carried out of Pennsylvania through 4 years of war, through 5 years of silence, through every nightmare and every empty morning and every long cold night when the cabin walls felt like the walls of a coffin and the silence felt like the silence of the dead. He did not kneel. Rowan Dunhill did not kneel for anything except wounded men and prayers he was not sure anyone heard. He sat in his chair and placed the ring on the table and said 6 words, "You belong here, if you want." Elowen looked at the ring. She looked at Rowan. Her green eyes were bright in the lamplight, and there was moisture on her lashes. Not tears of pain, not tears of grief, but the particular wetness of a person who has spent their entire life adrift and has just felt solid ground beneath their feet for the first time. "I want," she said. Her voice shook, but the words did not. Across the room, Beckett looked up from his trap. He held Elowen's gaze for a long moment, then nodded. Once, slow, complete. It was the most approval Beckett Dunhill had ever given to anything in his life, and both of them knew it, and the knowing was enough. Nolan closed his book and grinned the wide, genuine grin that was the rarest and most valuable expression in the Dunhill cabin, because it meant that the youngest brother, the one who felt everything, was happy. "Finally," and he said, "someone who can actually cook around here." 2 weeks later, Rowan carried a cradle into the cabin. He had built it in the woodworking shed, working in the early mornings before anyone else was awake, planing the pine boards smooth with a patience and precision that would have astonished anyone who knew him only as the silent man with the nightmares in the Winchester. The cradle was simple, 4 sides and a curved bottom, no ornamentation, no carving, just clean wood sanded to silk. He had built it not because Elowen was expecting a child, but because she had told Nolan a story one evening about the only kind woman in the orphanage, a kitchen worker named Mrs. Hargrove, who built cradles from scrap wood for every new baby that came through the door because she believed every child deserved to sleep in something made with love. Rowan had heard the story through the cabin door. He had not been meant to hear it, but he had heard it, and he had remembered, because Rowan Dunhill remembered everything that Elowen Ashby said, every word, every pause, every shift in tone that told him what she meant beneath what she said. Elowen stood in the center of the cabin and looked at the cradle for a long time. She touched the smooth wood with her fingertips, tracing the grain, and the expression on her face was one that none of the brothers had seen before. It was wonder pure and simple, the wonder of a woman who had been told by every circumstance of her life that she was disposable, and who was now holding evidence, tangible wood in hand, plain evidence that someone had listened to her story and built something from it. "You remembered," she said softly. "I remember everything," Rowan answered. 3 weeks after the cradle, a letter arrived at the Bitterroot Crossing post office, addressed to Elowen Ashby, care of Dunhill. Nolan brought it up the mountain with the weekly supplies, and Elowen opened it at the kitchen table while 3 pairs of eyes watched from various corners of the room, pretending not to watch. The letter was from the federal court. Crosby Phelps had been apprehended at Garrow Station. He was in custody awaiting trial. The 3 women found in the cellar had been freed and were receiving care. Elowen was requested to appear as a witness at the trial scheduled for summer. She read the letter twice. She set it down. She looked at Rowan. "I have to go testify," she said. Rowan nodded. "We go with you." "All 3 of you," Beckett spoke from his corner, his voice carrying the same flat certainty that had characterized every important thing he had ever said. "You think we let you go alone? Not a chance in hell." Nolan folded his book and stood, the smile on his face touched with something deeper than humor. "I've never seen a courthouse. Sounds interesting." Elowen looked at them. The man who spoke through silence and coffee left before dawn, and a mother's ring placed on a table without ceremony. The man who had wanted her gone from the first day, and who had taken a bullet defending her, and who said, "You walk out that door, I'd drag you back," in a voice that meant love in the only language he knew. The man who had read to her from medical texts and taught her to sew wounds, and whose warm, steady presence had been the first bridge between her terror and her trust. She had come to Montana to find a home. She had found instead a cellar in darkness and pain. She had crawled through snow and closed her eyes and waited for death. She had woken in a cabin full of strangers and reached for a knife. And now she was standing in that same cabin wearing a ring that had belonged to a dead woman she had never met, surrounded by 3 men who had each in their own particular and imperfect way given her the things she had spent 22 years searching for. Not a house, not walls and a roof and a stove. A home. The kind of home that is not a place but a promise, not a building but a belonging, not a thing you find, but a thing you build together out of silence in stubbornness, in the slow, terrifying decision to let another person matter to you. The letter lay on the table. The trial lay ahead. The world outside the cabin was still vast and complicated and filled with men who bought and sold and marked and discarded women as if they were less than livestock. That world had not changed. But the woman standing in the cabin had changed, and the men standing with her had changed, and the cabin itself had changed, and sometimes that is enough. Sometimes the change in one room in one clearing on one mountain is the beginning of a change that spreads outward like ripples from a stone dropped into still water, widening and widening until even the farthest shore feels the movement. The last light of the spring evening came through the cabin window, warm and golden, falling across the table, where the ring shone and the letter waited, and the cradle sat in the corner empty, but patient, holding the shape of a future that none of them had dared to imagine. Rowan stood on the porch with his coffee, looking out at the mountains. Elowen came out and stood beside him, her shoulder touching his. Inside, Nolan read aloud from a new book he had ordered from the general store, something about anatomy that he found endlessly fascinating and that Beckett found endlessly irritating. And Beckett's complaints drifted through the open door in a steady grumble that had become over the weeks and months as much a part of the cabin's music as the crackle of the stove or the whisper of the wind in the pines. "I never thought I'd have this," Elowen said. Rowan looked down at her. His amber eyes, which had been hard and flat and guarded for 9 years, held a softness that he showed to no one else in the world and never would. "None of us did," he said. She leaned into him. His hand came up and rested on her shoulder, his fingers settling over the round scar with a gentleness that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with reverence. She did not flinch, she did not cover it. She let his hand rest there, and in the warmth of his palm, against the mark that Crosby Phelps had put on her skin, the mark that was meant to say, "You are mine, you are property, you are nothing," she felt the last echo of that claim dissolve, replaced by something infinitely larger and infinitely quieter. The man who had belonged to no one, the woman who had been claimed by everyone. They stood on the porch of a cabin at the edge of the timberline with the sound of snowmelt rushing in the creek below and the sound of brothers arguing gently inside, and they belonged only to each other. The story did not end here. Ahead lay a courtroom and a reckoning, a journey down the mountain and into the machinery of justice that would determine whether the women still haunted by Crosby Phelps's cellar would ever truly be free. Ahead lay the long work of building a life in a place that had once wanted them gone and was only now learning to let them stay. Ahead lay mornings and evenings, and seasons, the ordinary accumulation of days. That is in the end the only thing that separates survival from living. But for now, in this moment, on this porch, in this light, it was enough. The fire was lit, the door was open, and no one was alone.